Welcome everyone to Color Commentary. We are your popper commentators, Michael Pechek and Adrian Guarzales. How's it going, Adrian?
Oh, good.
I'm glad to hear it. So let's get our upkeep taken care of, and we can get into our fan requested discussion topic of the week. So right up at the top of the show, we are brought to you in part by Original Magic Art. They do all sorts of neat and cool art-based products. You can purchase playmats, dice bags, art prints, and even tokens with art from Magic's history as well as the history of the rest of the world at large. And they make really, really quality things, all sorts of really neat stuff. Even if you're not a huge art nerd like me, they have products that will likely appeal to you. So you can step up the aesthetic aspect of your Magic games. They even have a Pauper token collection that has a bunch of useful tokens for our format. And if you are at all had your interest piqued during this brief little advertisement, if you go over there and use the affiliate code Commontary, all caps, as it is spelled in our podcast name, you'll get 5% off, and we get a little bit of a kickback. Again, that is Commontary, spelled as is in our name, and all caps. Adrian, what do you have for us this week?
Well, just like every week, I want to talk to you about our Patreon. We have more of them than ever. Thank you, patrons. It's awesome. For just as little as $1 per episode, you can hear the entire show. We had 13 minutes of pre-show this week. We also got a post-show, typically much briefer, and you get access to our patron-exclusive Discord channel, which Mike and I are, I think, pretty active in. I know that we have our ups and our downs, but I like to think that we are always available for our patrons if they want to chat with us. It's pretty nice.
Yeah.
And then I do want to soapbox for just a moment. I know a lot of folks don't like what they consider to be political commentary in their entertainment, but this really bothered me, and so I wanted to talk about it. I actually left the Pauper Facebook group recently. There was some kind of nastiness going on that's sort of been escalating since the new folks have joined us. And I just, there was something that happened that just, I won't go into too many details, but it really just was the final straw. And I was like, I can't take it anymore. So I left. And that really made me sad because I like to think that we are the best group of Magic players out there. And so for me to feel unwelcome in my own home, essentially, I can't imagine what it feels like for some of the new folks joining our format. So I would just like to encourage everyone to put your best foot forward. And I try and, talk to people with empathy, even though it is the internet. And I think really try and see where other people are coming from before you post. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off of it. I hope I didn't ruffle too many feathers. But we can go ahead and get on with the show now. Mike, do you want to say anything about it?
Just be kind to people. Like, we've talked about this before on the show. Like, just be kind to your fellow human beings and try to consider where they're coming from as well. Try to make our community a welcoming one and, treat people as you would like to be treated within this community.
Exactly.
We do have one other thing before we get to our main topic for the week. So folks might not be paying attention to the price of Magic cards as closely as we do, but we've had some price spikes in the past week. Standard Bearer ticked up to almost $9 over the weekend, and also, Gorilla Shaman's now a $2 card, and so is Prismatic Strands, and all these other old Pauper staples have kind of been getting some price adjustments with the increased attention the format's been getting. So kind of just wanted to give folks a heads up. If you're hesitating on some of these staples that go in a bunch of decks, and I know we just did a budgeting episode last week, so I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here. Pick up those cards now. Anything from recent eras is unlikely to go up hugely in value, but established staples that have low or limited print runs are definitely things you want to be picking up.
Yeah, can't stress it enough. It's never too early to buy cards, in my opinion. You'll win more than you'll lose on Magic cards. I will try to convince you over our next several episodes that this is actually a good thing. That means people like the format, and I have heard some people say that it is like Frontier. Pauper is not like Frontier. Frontier was a flash of the pan format created by players, whereas Pauper is a wizard supported format, and so your investment is safe in my opinion. And it sucks that it goes up, but that's the cost of becoming a more competitive format.
That, and tell me any other format that has a plethora of like sub $2 sideboard cards. I mean, I guess maybe standard, but that's because I don't pay attention to standard.
Right.
All right, so this week's topic is one that we really haven't covered in depth since episode 7, I believe. So it's been
at 2 Brute.
It's been a minute. It's been a minute since we talked about brewing. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about brewing within Pauper. And this was suggested by Discord user Darkfire, who is one of our patrons. And we kind of wanted to get into this because while we've covered the topic in the past, it was literally covered almost 2 years ago at this point. So things have changed, to say the least. And I guess, Adrian, what's your experience with brewing in this format?
I think I'm the polar opposite of Mike. I am not a brewer. I like to play with established decks. I like to go to MTG Goldfish, see what I like, see what to do. I'm really not a great person, I think, to talk about this, except that I'm like the opposition view. Whereas Mike, for example, works constantly with the rest of our play group to develop new decks, who are very good at it, actually.
Yeah. And I think you just touched on something that's very important here. Brewing on your own is much different than brewing in a group. And I definitely think that there's a lot to be gained by sort of doing this in a communal setting. But let's sort of talk about starting points. So like where the initial idea for brewing a new list comes from. And we kind of broke it down into 4 different sort of starting points. And I want to tackle the first one. So one of the ways that I see a lot of people sort of starting on decks is seeing a interesting synergy. And the example I wrote here is one that I've seen before used in like some kind of janky brews, and that's Oromancer and Angelic Renewal. And for those who've never encountered these, what it does is it gets you this very slow loop where you have a 2/2 that basically can't die as long as your graveyard isn't being messed with. And I think that with synergy based ideas, it definitely benefits you to make sure that before you sort of start down this path that you have a critical density of a specific type of effect that you want to have enact. And with the specific example I gave of Oromancer and Angelic Renewal, there is the slight issue of there's no copies 5 through 8 of Angelic Renewal. So with these synergy based decks, you want to make sure that you're not, leaning into like eight solitary cards in your deck and hoping that that's going to work. That said, Adrian, you admittedly play a lot of a very synergistic deck, and I think, for example, the Core Skyfisher and Prophetic Prism combination has redundancy in the form of other creatures that bounce permanents and other cantripping artifacts. So that's really synergy.
Correct. And sometimes a deck really just needs 8 of an effect in order to work. Honestly, in order for you to have a core to build around, you need some level of redundancy in the deck. So
that, and I think it also highlights a good thing, like that's a deck that used to play Ichor Wellspring, and yes, it did also have the synergy with Kuldotha Rebirth, but it's now moved away from the Wellspring because it just doesn't do enough. So in this example of Oromancer and Angelic Renewal, you can kind of stretch a little bit more out of Oromancer by saying, okay, well, I'm going to play Oromancer. I might as well play some sweet enchantments that will synergize well with it when I don't have the Angelic Renewal.
Right.
So do you want to tackle our next one, classes of cards?
Yeah, and I will admit I'm actually not 100% sure what you meant by this. Mike did write the notes. So you classes of cards, instant and sorcery interactions. Am I correct in assuming that an example of this in another format might be oh crap, I can't remember the name. The Tutor Sack Lion's Eye Diamond, is that what you mean here?
Well, more broadly speaking, for example, like saying I want to build like an artifact deck, or I want to build like a deck where casting instants and sorceries matters, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. So
or
I think you should.
Enchantress in Legacy.
Oh, so you mean like the things that I do matter with the other things that I do in a big way, like the like Methonical's enchantment control deck.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of thing, where you're starting from like, I have this pool of sweet cards that all share something in common. I want to see if there's a deck here.
Okay, I apologize for not understanding what you meant more by that. That's totally my bad. You probably explained it to me even. Yeah, so like, and I think a good example of this in our format might be slivers. I have all these slivers and they all do stuff with each other. And so that's sweet. And I think tribes maybe fall more into the synergistic element, but it's basically like if I do like you mentioned affinity too. So it's like if I play a ton of artifacts and all my cards interact with artifacts and I've got something going on here. And I think that you typically see that more than Mike's, like just the synergy. You see that spread throughout the entire deck. So I think another example of that might be Tortured Existence, where you have a graveyard, like very extensive graveyard interaction.
Yeah, and this plays into synergy a bit, but here we're talking less about like powerful synergies and more just sort of like instead of having a couple of 10 out of 10 synergies, you have a lot of 5 out of 10 synergies where all the things are going to play nice with one another, but it might not be as high impact. And I think Affinity is a great example of a synergistic deck that cares about a card type in this case, and that really helps bring it all together. Next up for a starting point, we have adapting something else from another format. And we had the examples of Tron, Elves, and Burn. And in Pauper, Tron is a little bit different than it shows up in Modern. We don't have access to 7-mana Planeswalkers or Planeswalkers at all. The top end in Pauper is not quite as impressive as it is in Modern. But the decks still share some similarities, especially back in the days of Rugtron, which sort of had the Stars and Spheres plan as well, and sort of leaned more into the resolve a big threat and just beat someone to death with it. And then we have Elves, which is actually incredibly reminiscent of Legacy Elves. And then we have Burn, which is, again, very similar to Legacy Burn, but with a different creature base and missing a couple of key pieces. But when you're adapting something else from another format, you need to realize that sometimes things are not going to perfectly one-to-one mirror one another. For example, Elves needs a different payload than it does in Legacy. In Legacy, you're just ramping into, a Craterhoof Behemoth or natural ordering out a Progenitus or something like that. Whereas in Pauper, you're just trying to get a critical density on the board and just overwhelm your opponent. But you can take inspiration, at least from a list in another format, even if it doesn't wind up, quite mirroring up. There are plenty of people who have asked over the years, what does Jund look like in Pauper? And the answer is actually it's a mid-range black deck.
And I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think you explained it perfectly. I think that the two most common types of new folks coming to the format, or even existing folks saying, what can I do that's new and original? Either they're trying to adapt something from another format, and I think Jund is sort of the I don't know what the word is, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that no one ever can seem to find, as like one of the most, like, I'm really trying to brew a sweet Jund deck and I can't seem to do it. And we'll talk about that later. Because it has mostly to do with the lands. And then the other one is sweet single cards. The example we have is Costly Plunder, which is a new card from, I think, is it from Rivals or is it just from regular Ixalan?
No, I think it's regular Ixalan, if I remember.
And it's just 3 mana, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, draw 2 cards. And people really want to play this card. I feel like it's one that I see a lot where people are like, how do I make Costly Plunder work? I don't know if you can, but I think that when people see, especially in spoiler season, they'll see like a single card and think, wow, how can I play that? That seems awesome. Sometimes it actually is a sweet card like Costly Plunder that maybe it's just a little overcosted. But I have seen some people say, well, how can I make Mutiny work? And I'm just like, you just can't. Why would you ever try and make Mutiny work?
Yeah.
And then as a subtype of the sweet single card, you would have a card that would go in an existing shell. So in this example, it would be maybe you put Costly Plunder, Dusk Legion Zealot into mono black control. So you're trying to sweet new card, or you have a new card that you think could be a brand new engine which would in turn generate a new archetype, hopefully. And a card like that might be a card more like, the existing example is Tortured Existence, but a more recent one might be a card like Seeker of the Way, where we now have a blue-white prowess list floating around, or at least in our play group floating around.
Yeah, and I think with those engine cards, it doesn't always have to be as explicit as something like Tortured Existence, but finding something where you're like, okay, I think we now have critical density of this type of effect, and or this thing is just really reinforcing this theme strongly enough that I think I can put together 60 cards that'll work with this.
Or in the case of Drake, it's powerful enough and catapults that deck to a new height.
Yeah. And we are talking about a card that is now banned, but that was definitely one that sort of took an existing archetype. And I remember in the early days after Eternal Masters, people were like, oh, well, just play it in the familiar shell. And then people quickly realized, oh no, just play blue-red mid-range and like have a combo finish, and that's way better. So these are definitely sort of the rarest examples, the engine cards that you can build a whole deck around. I at one point was working with a list that Alex had thrown together that had that revolved around Prying Blade for the artifact synergy therein and the ramp that you get out of it. So that didn't quite work out, but be on the lookout whenever sets come out for interesting cards that have unique effects within our metagame, because those can be ones that you might be able to leverage into a sweet new brew. Now, after you've found, your starting point, whatever path you choose, the next step I like to go with is gathering up cards. And the best piece of advice I can give you is learning how to use advanced card search engines. I would immediately advise you ditch Gatherer, pick up something that's either like Scryfall or magiccards.info. Both of those are really, really solid resources. And I know at least Scryfall just has a filter. You can just, in your search query, include F:"pauper, and it will only return whatever the rest of your query is. It'll only return cards that are pauper legal. So this really helps eliminate a lot of time wasted in terms of trying to find, everything that cares about artifacts somewhere in its text box in the colors white, blue, and black. It's much easier when you don't have to filter through stuff for other formats. But once you've got that, I generally like to say if I have a broader theme, I want to build an enchantment based deck, I'm going to start with a wide card pool and sort of narrow things down as it goes. But if I find a card, for example, like Tortured Existence, if I wanted to build around Tortured Existence, I'd start with that and I'd try to find cards that have a level of synergy with it, and sort of try and tie everything back to what I'm building around. And I guess Adrian, do you have any other tips for like sort of gathering up cards? I mean, even in the case of you where you start with established lists, do you have any things that you like to do if you're looking for spicy inclusions?
I will regale you with an anecdote of my very early Magic years in which, in college, I traded a bottle of Evan Williams to my friend Phil for his entire Magic collection. It included, and I was very, I was in college and I didn't know what I was doing, City of Traders and Force of Will, which I ended up getting rid of to buy standard cards. Yuck, I know. Really kicking myself over that today. But what I did was I sorted all the cards, and maybe some of you at home can relate to this story. I sorted all the cards into piles, and I decided I wanted to play black because I really liked the skull symbol. And so I took out all my black cards and I started placing them all out. And here's a bunch of Masks cards and Exodus cards and a lot of really neat stuff. And so I start looking at my cards and I see that I have these creatures that are called Dothy, and they have this ability called Shadow, which makes them unblockable. Basically unblockable. And I was like, that's pretty sweet. And then I noticed I had 2 copies of this card called Hatred. And I said, wow, this seems like they'd be really good together. And so I built a mono black Dothy Hatred deck. And I essentially, with obviously this deck was I don't know if it was a thing ever, but I'm sure it's like a casual deck. I essentially brewed mono black aggro by myself. And so it can be as simple as that. You just look at the cards in your collection and think, wow, what sweet stuff can I do with this? That's a great way to introduce your friends to Magic too. So that's my 2 cents. And I never really get to tell that story, so I kind of wanted to.
Yeah. And also personally, like I just have a large Pauper collection that has like, as I mentioned in our last episode, I'll definitely pick up stuff where I'm like, this could be interesting to play at some point. So it definitely helps to have your collection sorted so you can just kind of flip through and be like, maybe this is right. This is the right spot for this, you know. I don't have anywhere else to put this card, but this could maybe fit here. So also, when you're in the preliminary brewing stages, unless you have a plan that's a little bit more complicated, I would advise sticking to 1 to 3 colors. You know,
3, you monster.
Yeah, I'm being generous here. You really, I cannot stress this enough. If it's your first time brewing a deck in Pauper, don't go overboard on your colors. You will thank me, because the mana in our format is the big sort of constraint.
It's the roadblock. Yeah.
Like you do not want to try to be hitting your splash color when you're running slow fetches and you're going to be a turn behind by the time you actually hit it. All right. So now that I've gone out, I have a plan. And to return to the earlier example, I want to play an enchantment based deck. I've got this big list of cards. You know, I've got my abundant growths. I've got Oromancers. I've got protective sphere. I've got like all these cards that I think will fit well together. When I sit down, how am I going to generate a list? And I think there's 2 ways to sort of approach this. And one is generating multiple versions of the same list and sort of shipping them around, seeing which people react better to, or, you know, trying out all of those lists and then figuring out which one seems to be the most successful. There is the other school of thought, though, where it's just toss together 60 cards, hop in a queue, like a two-person queue, or even, dare I say it, the tournament practice room, and just sort of getting some experience with the deck. And Adrian, as someone who doesn't do a whole lot of brewing, which one of those would you sort of instinctively go with?
That's tough, because my desire to be competitive is only matched by my desire to not spend money. So I think if you really want the most bang for your buck, I think you should do maybe a league run is too much. Maybe that's too much of an investment. I think that is the best way to, you know, really drive the deck is in the league. I think that's where you'll get most of your good testing done. But there's nothing wrong with tournament practice. And if you are able to and willing and don't mind I think the 2-man or the 2-people queues, are really only like 1 step up from tournament practice. I think really where the good testing is the leagues. But I think for a middle of the road 2-people practice is good. But honestly, I do a lot of testing in tournament practice just because it's free. So make of that what you will based on your resources.
No, totally fair. And I think the big thing when you have when you have the rough idea of your deck list, what I like to do is I like to say 9 to 12 cards that you really want to play out of your big list that you've gathered up. Pick out 9 to 12 of them, and for each of those, you get like 2 to 4 copies of them. Don't, you know, worry about singleton copies that much unless you're really definite on wanting, you know, just one silver bullet that you can, I don't know. For example, if you're playing Mystical Teachings, you can kind of get a little teched out with your one-ofs. But generally, I like to start with the first draft of something being fairly homogeneous because this increases the likelihood of me seeing the cards that I want to see every game, because you're more likely to draw something if there's 4 copies of it out of your 60 cards. And this sort of lets you get an idea of going, okay, well, this is the rough of it. I saw the cards that I wanted to see every game, and either it seems to work when I get the right combination of cards, or it seems to work in general, or it doesn't seem to work even when I get that right set of cards. So I think generally when you're starting out, you want your deck to be, you know, a lot of 4-ofs, and it may end that way as well. There's nothing wrong with a deck that's a bunch of 4-ofs. I mean, what does what does Stompy look like these days? I'm pretty sure it's still mostly 4 ofs with a handful of 2 and 3 ofs. So
No, you're exactly right. So
yeah, don't
redundancy
worry.
is good, it turns out.
Yeah, and sometimes it's what you need in a deck. But sometimes as it evolves, you'll want like one copy of a specific answer to a specific situation because it comes up frequently enough that it's worth including in your main board. So I think, rough draft, lots of copies of cards just so you can make sure you see them. And as you go, we'll talk more about testing, but you can definitely refine that to a sharper edge. Do you want to talk to people a little bit about land choices, Adrian?
Yeah, absolutely. Lands are, just like in every format, extremely key to ours. If you look at a well-tuned legacy mana base, for example, you will notice how lean they run and how much they're trying to maximize every land draw because that's such a low mana format. We're pretty similar here. We don't have the greatest fetches. We don't have true duels, so you have to take that into account. If you need more mana than most decks, like let's say you're a control deck, let's say you're is it Fairies list or the Drake list or what have you, run Karuz. The only real deck that I think gets away with not doing that is Mono Black because it's one color, but even the Boros lists run Karuz to get value off the land, certainly, but also just because that deck needs a lot of mana. So definitely look at the Ravnica bounce lands when you are examining your list. I'm not saying jam 4 of each color you're in into your list if you're 3 colors, because there is a real cost for running them in your deck, but they are a good option for 2-color decks that tend towards the heavier end of mana. If you need sorry, go ahead.
Those are also lands that you'll definitely see even in 3-color lists in some amount, just because it does take your 3-lander. A 3-lander with a Karoo in it is a lot of times a lot more playable in a deck that cares about hitting 4 or 5 mana than just the 3 basics. So that is a pretty big deal.
If you need artifact synergy, run artifact lands. I know that seems like a no-brainer, but the artifact lands are powerful cards in our format. You don't just have to run them in Affinity. I believe that there is a blue-black artifact control list running around out there. And I don't just mean the Thought Picker Witch list. I think that there are a couple, but if you want artifact lands, feel free to run artifact lands. They fuel a lot of very powerful spells, and you can play them in a list that's not really 100% artifact based. Like I believe this is eons ago at this point, but back when MBC was really strong, most decks did run 1 or 2 just to get around Mind Wrench or Wrench Mind, excuse me.
Yeah. And these are more of a niche case scenario, but when you need them, you need them.
Then, of course, we have our shuffle lands. Ash Barrens is much better if you need access to an immediate splash. Let's say, the best example I know of is at Delver. They need the red and they need it now. They don't want to have to wait a turn for it. They can just cycle the land and then get the red. So it's perfect for decks like that. But most decks, if you're playing more than one color, you can probably get away with Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. Although, to be honest, Evolving Wilds always the correct choice. Yes.
I like the art more. That would be my pick. I don't know if you've seen. I don't know if you've seen the not to tangent too hard, but I don't know if you've seen the League promo that they're giving out for Evolving Wilds.
Oh, what? Hold up. How new is that?
Oh, you haven't it's very new. I picked one up last week. They are very, very nice. They're a foil and they show wonderful examples of terrace farming, an actual real world practice. It's real nice though.
These. I have the
they're real nice.
I want these. All right.
Yeah, the F&M promo I think is still correct, but we've gone off on a tangent enough.
Yeah.
There's one more type of land that we have listed here that maybe you can go a little bit into.
Yeah, absolutely. It's Tron. Tron is the new teachings. By that I mean it's a wide open deck. If you have the Tron shell, you can kind of play whatever you want, and I think it's the deck and the format that really allows the most for that kind of customization of the list. Tron lands are strong. They're powerful. We don't have anything else like them in the format that are really that good. Cloud Post is banned. So if you like the big mana idea, you can't go wrong with the Tron deck. And it's really like, and I know that this is sort of like taking an existing archetype and then tuning it to your own preferences. But if you're playing Tron and you're playing like the good Tron cards, you can kind of play whatever you want, and you're probably still going to win most of the time, even if you're not playing like the optimal payoff for the deck.
Yeah, it's very, very powerful. Now, there's one thing that I want to get into here just real briefly that we didn't put down here. The cycling lands. When do people want to play the cycling lands?
I see them usually in the monocolored. I see them in two places. I see them in mono black control, which doesn't care about its lands because it plays a ton of them and it needs to draw. And I see them in the Boros lists, because they can play them and then later bounce them back to hand to cycle them or discard them to Sin's Enlistment. So I think that those are the main two decks playing them. I think in most cases you don't really need them by and large, but if you're playing like a monocolored deck and you just want some extra draw power in your deck, I think they're fine choices.
Yeah, I did just want to touch on those because they do have a place within the format. Next little note we have here. Play 60 cards, please. Just, it increases the frequency at which you will draw cards in your deck, and it makes your life a whole lot easier. I know there's a temptation to run 61 because you just can't cut a card. Please, cut the card. It'll be worth it in the long run. And finally, sideboards. And when you're building a sideboard, when you start off with a brew and you're just kind of in the infant stages of testing it, I think you just kind of need to think about things in broad terms as opposed to, very specific things. So artifact hate, enchantment hate, graveyard hate, specific color hate, and sweepers are things that are usually pretty valuable to come out of the board. There are also considerations for things like Dispel, these conditional cheaper counter spells. And obviously one of the best of those out there is Hydroblast and Pyroblast, which are incredibly good in the matchups where they're relevant. But just kind of try to flesh out a sideboard that has answers to a majority of things. As you get into testing, this will obviously change. But at the beginning, just kind of try and go, all right, I have answers to a variety of threats. Any other advice for early sideboards?
I think you said it all. There's powerful established cards. Your deck can probably play them.
Yeah. Now, when we get into testing, the first thing I want to stress is test more. Like, you definitely want to get as many matches under your belt as possible when you're brewing a deck, because it lets you see how it performs over the long run. For example, if you're playing an aggro deck, you're probably not seeing a majority of your deck in any given game that you're winning. So you may need a larger sample size than other decks that are, drawing through cards rapidly and have the chance to see a wider variety of cards and how they play out. But definitely test as much as you humanly can. And this might be the part where Adrian takes over a little bit more than I do, but you're definitely the sort of person who likes to take a list and really, really refine it. And I think maybe it would be great to pick your brain a little bit on your process for testing and refining a list.
Yeah, I was talking about it a little bit before the show, but for example, for my GP Kyoto trip, in March, we are essentially, one of my buddies, one of my teammates, printed a bunch of decks, and they do this in other formats all the time, and he just sleeved up a proxy legacy gauntlet, and we're not going to stop testing until each member of the team, and we have one for standard and one for modern and one for legacy. Each member of the team has 3 wins against the decks that we have determined to be what we might face against in the GP. And I think that that's great. That's a great way to really get a feel for your deck, see what its good matchups are, what its bad matchups are. And if you don't have that kind of time and resources, Magic Online is fine. And in both of these examples, what I would recommend you do is to keep a record of your win and loss ratio against specific decks. And if you can, and I know some people do this in paper, take notes about the match. Like, what did your opponent bring in? What did you bring in? What did you bring out? And you can turn your F&M tournament into basically a testing session, on top of trying to win, of course. But your friends who play Magic, your friends who play Pauper are going to be your best resource. I'm friends with everyone I play Pauper with at Pat's, And after a match, even if it was a particularly humiliating or frustrating one, we try and talk about where did we go, what happened in the match, what were the key moments where decisions were made that won or lost someone the game. And I think another thing that you have to take into consideration with testing is you have to be brutally honest with yourself. You can't say, well, that's a bad matchup, or well, he got lucky, or you have to say, on turn whatever, my decision to fetch instead of to play a land regularly was enough of a micro disadvantage that it ended up in the long run costing me the game when you combine it with some other decisions I made over the course of the match. So I think being really honest with yourself and having friends who are willing to be honest with you is very integral to a good testing process. Otherwise, you're in an echo chamber and you think your deck is super good, and then you take it online and you don't do very well, and then a group of people refine it further, and then you're like, well, why am I not getting? Why didn't I do that well? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. I think levels of brutal honesty and being able to go in with the mindset of this might not work is incredibly valuable. Being able to admit to yourself, like, okay, I tried a thing and it just isn't working, is incredibly useful, because in the long run, it will save you time, and you can move on to different brews and different ideas that you have, just because you are not, and none of us are, just completely all-knowing and able to figure out things on the first pass. And it might just be the case that the deck is bad. It might be that you're attacking it from a slightly incorrect angle. And so having people to bounce ideas off of and being honest with yourself is really useful as a part of this process. And like, I can't stress enough, there are a lot of ideas people have had for brews out there. And, you know, some of them have been bad, and that's totally okay. It's totally okay to try something and fail, but without trying it, you're never going to know whether or not it's good. So when you're testing, as Adrian said, take a lot of notes. Just really sort of try and document as much as you can. And one of the great things about testing on MitGo is you can see replays of your games. Like, that's a thing that you can go and do, and you can sort of break it down as much as you want and go, okay, well, this is the turning point of the game, and, you know, I lost this because I made a small error. Not necessarily, it lets you isolate whether or not the deck building is the issue or your in-game play is the issue, because those two things are separate. Like, you can build a good deck and then pilot it in a way that didn't allow you to win a game that you could have. And vice versa, you could be a great pilot and just playing a subpar list that's never going to get there. So I really think sitting back and being self-critical about these things is really, really useful in this process. This is, as with any other creative process, an iterative thing where you're going to want to return to your ideas. And I think another thing that's worth pointing out is, if you have an idea and you try it out and it doesn't work, don't just delete the deck list out of frustration. Hang on to it and re-examine at a later date when maybe a new card has been released, or maybe you realized, oh, there's something else that fits here, and maybe that's what it needs to push it over the edge. So I really think that, you know, as you said, Adrian, that brutal honesty and being able to tell yourself, no, this is a bad idea, I should stop wasting time on it and move on, is really, really important. And I guess you definitely play a lot more MitGo than I do. Do you have any suggestions for testing specifically for folks who can only play online, who don't perhaps have a paper group that they can play with?
Gang, testing on Moto is the easiest thing in the world. You don't have to deal with the sleeves, the decks, the boxes, taking things anywhere, whatever. Find a community, post on Reddit, get on the Discord. See, there are people there who will test with you and will tell you if your ideas are good or not. Those are, you know, real people out there who probably play a lot of Moto too. Run it through leagues is a big one. But if you really want that real feedback, I think that those are, you know, the Reddit and the Discord are two great communities where you can really hone your list. And I think the Discord's a little bit better because the responses are in real time. Very easy to get on there, find a partner, and get going. Just say you want to test, and people should be willing to test with you.
Yeah, and the great thing about testing with someone who you can communicate with afterwards is, as you pointed out, like, with your real world example, talking through like, hey, what didn't work, what worked and what didn't work in my list, and trying to figure out like if there was a weird play at some point, like were you playing around something that I may or may not have had, and figuring out where your opponent's mind was during the game and figuring out what influenced their decisions also helps you be a better player. But it can also help, like if someone goes, yeah, no, you cast this spell and you used counter magic to make sure it resolved, but I really don't think that mattered in the great scheme of things, is really useful advice. So again, being able to test with people you can communicate with afterwards is unparalleled in my mind when it comes to refining lists or working on brews.
It takes a village, as the old adage goes, and it's very true of this. And then, people will also tell you like, I really don't think that's the direction you want to go in with the deck, So I think it's I think really what we're trying to drive home is that the community is very, very important. And much more so in brewing.
Yeah. So, and outside of just testing with other people, I think the big thing is, again, sample size. Like as you're going, make sure that you're not just, testing a little bit and going, all right, well, deck works, let's jam some leagues with it. It needs no more refinement. I think having those layers of refinement will help you out in the long run, and being willing to always change how the deck is built is just endlessly useful, because it means that you're willing to go, okay, things have changed, it's time for the deck to change as well. So yeah, just be open to the idea that you may be wrong, because it will free you in the long run and make you a better player, make you a better deck builder, because once you realize that, it really does give you a layer of freedom that you didn't have before, because it lets you go, okay, I can release my ego from this situation and instead just focus on, is this thing working? Like, just being able to say, I had a bad idea, but at least I tried it, is better than just sitting there with your head in the sand going, no, this deck is perfect, I just keep getting unlucky matchups.
Yeah, and I think we've harped on that point quite a bit, but I really don't think it can be overstated.
Yeah. So once you've gone through the refining process, that's really where you have to make the call. It was this experiment successful? And again, with iterative design, you got to go, did this work? Or was this a cool idea that just couldn't get there, and move from there? Because if it's working, you're going to start doing well in leagues. You're going to start being able to participate in challenges at a respectable level. And, those aren't the only metrics for success, but they help you define whether or not what you've tried is working. So go out there, get investigative, find cool interactions between cards, and try them out. Worst case scenario, it doesn't work, and you can go back to another list, or you can go on to the next brew. So there are, God, it's like 5,000 pauper legal cards. You can always, go out there and try something else out new. So go out, brew. It might be successful, it might not, but go out and try something new. I guess, do you have any other sort of closing ideas here that you want to sort of ram home to the folks listening?
Yeah, I think I should just recap it real fast. Figure out what you want to do. Does it exist? I think one thing that we should, and I know I'm sort of shoehorning this in on the end here, but I just thought of it. Sometimes there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And what I mean by that is, and I think this is Patrick Chapin advice even, if you're brewing, don't try and make a second-rate version of a deck that already exists. If that makes sense.
I think that's really good advice. Just, sometimes things are already good. Like, I remember a while back, what was it? That card from Shadows over Innistrad, Alms of the Vein, the drain 3 that you could cast for a black if you madness it. Like, people got very into the idea of building like a black-red burn deck, and it turns out one of the things that works really well about Burn is you get to run a bunch of basic mountains, which means you get to run Fire Blast, which means you also don't have to worry about hitting a second color of mana. And I think that's a good thing. Like, don't just build something that's a second-rate version of an existing deck because it seems cool.
Or do it. I guess it really depends on your goals. If you want to play that with just your friends, sure. But I think where Mike and I are coming from is brewing a deck that you eventually intend to be competitive and to take to the league or the two other big paper tournaments. So that, I guess, some goal recognition does play a factor into this. But I do think a lot of people say, well, I could put Scrib Sprite in the Delver, and now my flying matchups are much better. And it's like, well, your deck doesn't really need Scrib Sprite, So
yeah. There's the too cute sort of issue where you're just trying to do something that's just different and doesn't actually have a strategic advantage to it.
Correct.
So,
and I think that's really the last point I wanted to drive home in the episode. I won't recap. You can just re-listen to it if you need to.
Yeah. Just go waste another 40 minutes listening to us talk at you. It's a good idea. Trust us. We're doctors.
Mash that like button.
Yeah. But yeah, go out, have fun, brew, and you know what, listeners at home, if you have a neat little brew that you've been working on, share it with us. Worst case scenario, it's something we've seen before, and we might not get back to you immediately. Best case scenario, it's something cool, and we'll talk about it on the podcast. There's definitely a lot of interesting ideas.
I'm gonna up the ante. If you have a sweet brew, why don't you message me on our Discord and tell me, and I will play you. I will turn on Moto, and we will test your sweet brew, and I will tell you what I think. That's an open invitation. Hit me up.
All right, there you go. We've got actual money on the table in the hypothetical sense. So not actual money at all, but all right. So I think that pretty much covers it all. I think we've given you a good intro to brewing. If you're more interested in this stuff, there are plenty of articles about brewing out there. I'd highly recommend the folks over at MTG Goldfish have a series called the Brewer's Minute that talks about specific concepts within brewing. So, for example, they did a video on planning out in a deck that has a ramp package, figuring out how you want your ramp spells to line up with your payloads. So they go into a lot of sort of more minute details. This is obviously, a 3,000-foot view that we're giving you here, but being able to have access to a resource where you can see like, oh, I'm interested in building a ramp deck in Pauper. I should learn how, I want my ramp spells to play out over the course of the game and, get maximum value from them. So definitely check them out. There are people writing about brewing across all sorts of different formats. I would highly advise looking towards a variety of articles because there's obviously Pauper has unique limitations to it. Our mana bases aren't as good as even, say, standards are. But going out there and looking at a wide variety of articles will give you a better idea of how to brew in general. And you can hopefully take the lessons you learn there and apply them to Pauper. So go out, read some more content, check it out, build brews, get in touch with us, test those brews, and have a good time. Adrian, you want to maybe take us out of the show?
Sure. First, I got to do my patron shout out. Sorry, I think I've been doing it the last couple of times, actually. I want to give a shout out to Jeff CK, aka Any New Province. Any New Province is also a Pauper content producer. So please check out his Twitch. He's a great guy. He's funny. So check him out. He's cool. Other than that, thanks for joining us today. This podcast is brought to you by the support of our patrons. Please consider supporting us if you like the show. Check Lou's video or the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you that if you're listening to this on a platform with reviews, they're always appreciated because they boost our visibility and they let us know how we're doing. If you've got a deck list or idea for a topic, you can contact us either via our website or by emailing us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to my LGS Pat's Games and Michael's LGS JP Comics, and especially the ever musically talented L, who does our theme song Quantitative. You can find that and other great tracks over at soundcloud.net/ELLELLELL. Till next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.